What does it mean when the most dangerous weapons ever built are treated as routine cargo inside a permanent system of readiness? Some catastrophes do not come from a system failing unexpectedly, but from a system functioning exactly as designed under intolerable risk. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. This episode explores The Day We Lost the H-Bomb by Barbara Moran as a systems-level analysis of how nuclear deterrence, military routine, and institutional normalization combine to make catastrophic risk a permanent feature of Cold War strategy.
And I think we really need to emphasize that up front, because the title, The Day We Lost the H-Bomb, it sounds like a Hollywood geopolitical thriller.
Yeah, exactly, like a race against time.
Right, but the actual historical reality of this book is much more complex. This isn't just a true crime story or a disaster recount. We're doing a full autopsy of a very specific system today.
And that system is the Strategic Air Command, or SAC.
SAC, during the absolute height of the Cold War. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore this psychological and structural phenomenon. It's the crisis in perception.
Which happens when you're just constantly exposed to apocalyptic danger.
Yeah, round-the-clock exposure. And through sheer repetition and military doctrine, that danger stops feeling dangerous. It literally just becomes everyday administrative procedure. We're looking at how a system absorbs the extraordinary and just forcefully standardizes it into the ordinary.
I really want you, the listener, to try and put yourself in that headspace for a second. Imagine standing on the edge of the world's most destructive machine. You are looking down into the gears of something that possesses the literal capacity to end human civilization. But to you and to everyone operating those gears, it is just another Tuesday.
It's just a shift at work.
Exactly. So to really ground this abstraction, let's start with a very human moment. The date is Sunday, January 16th, 1966.
And we're in Goldsboro, North Carolina.
Right. And Barbara Moran's book introduces us to Captain Charles Wendorf. He is 30 years old. He's got this blonde buzz cut, an athletic build. And on this particular Sunday morning, he is sitting in St. Luke's Methodist Church,
Teaching his weekly Sunday school class to a bunch of teenagers.
which is such a deliberate choice by the author, right, to start the narrative there.
Oh, absolutely. It perfectly frames the baseline of American normalcy before introducing the hardware. You have this earnest guy with a deep faith in God, America, the Air Force.
And he had this really gentle, self-deprecating way about him. Somebody asked him at one point if the kids in his Sunday school class looked up to him, because outside of that church, he was a hotshot bomber pilot.
Carrying the most destructive weapons known to man.
Right. And Wendorf just kind of chuckled and said, well, I guess I suppose they did.
Which highlights this fascinating duality. You have a man teaching Sunday school, representing the quintessential mid-century suburban ideal, who is going to, in just a matter of hours, take command of an aircraft designed for global annihilation. And the transition between those two states of being is entirely seamless for him.
Totally seamless. After church wraps up, he gets in the car with his wife, Betty, to drive back to their home on Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. He has to squeeze in a quick nap because he has a pre-flight briefing at 3:30 that afternoon.
But on the drive, Betty actually speaks up.
She does. She tells him she has a bad feeling about tonight's flight. She actively wishes he could get out of it.
And he brushes it off.
Completely. He reassures her that he has flown this exact mission more than 50 times. To him, it is perfectly routine. He tells her there's absolutely nothing to worry about. He goes home, takes his nap, wakes up, puts on his olive green flight suit, grabs his briefcase, and heads to the squadron headquarters.
And this is where we really need to pause and look at the psychology of the system. Wendorf's belief that this flight is perfectly routine is not a personal failing.
No, not at all.
It's not a lapse in judgment. It is exactly how the Strategic Air Command was designed to function. A system cannot maintain a constant 24-hour posture of nuclear readiness if its operators are paralyzed by the existential weight of their cargo. The normalization of the abnormal is a prerequisite for the system's survival.
And you see that normalization in the rest of the crew, too. Wendorf is sharing pilot duties with two other men. His co-pilot is First Lieutenant Michael Rooney.
The 25-year-old bachelor.
Yeah, the guy who enjoys the nightlife. And that very morning, Rooney had actually parked his big, white 1963 Chevy Impala convertible illegally.
Right, in a senior officer's designated spot.
Because he figured he'd be back from the mission before the officer showed up for work the next day.
It's such a mundane 25-year-old thing to do. Parking in the boss's spot, it speaks volumes about his state of mind. He is not approaching this mission as a potential world-ending event. He's approaching it as a shift at work.
And rounding out the pilots, you have the relief pilot, Major Larry Messenger. He's 44, the veteran of the group, and his background is intense.
Yeah, he's a World War II vet.
Right. Messenger was flying a B-17 bomber over Germany when he was shot down. The plane cartwheeled, crashed on its back. Messenger survived by hanging upside down from his seatbelt in the no man's land between the German and American lines for an entire week before he was rescued.
Wow.
So this is a man who has experienced the absolute extremes of combat, the literal chaos of a failing machine in a war zone. And now, in 1966, he is just filling in as a relief pilot on what is considered a standard patrol.
If you look at these three men structurally, they form a perfect cross-section of the military apparatus.
Yeah.
You have the earnest institutional believer in Wendorf, the young, slightly rebellious, but capable junior officer in Rooney,
Yeah.
and the battle-hardened, pragmatic veteran in Messenger.
Yeah, they aren't zealots.
None of these men are wild-eyed zealots eager to trigger World War III. They are rational, ordinary men doing a job. They are functional cogs in a massive machine. The paradox is that their ordinary job involves interacting with technology that is completely unprecedented in human history.
Let's talk about that technology. After their pre-flight briefing, these three guys walk out onto the tarmac and approach their aircraft. It's a B-52 bomber. This is a mammoth machine. Wendorf genuinely loved flying it. He used to say that despite its massive size, you could thread a needle with it.
They walk past the massive landing gear and head straight to the bomb bay.
Because their specific task before boarding is to inspect their cargo, and that cargo consists of 4 Mark 28 hydrogen bombs.
We really need to establish the physical and mathematical scale of that cargo because the numbers are almost too large to comprehend intuitively. Each one of those 4 Mark 28 bombs packed 1.45 megatons of explosive power.
1.45 megatons.
To put that in historical perspective, a single megaton is the equivalent of 1 million tons of TNT. The atomic bomb that destroyed the city of Hiroshima and killed tens of thousands of people in an instant was roughly 15 to 20 kilotons.
Right.
So one single Mark 28 hydrogen bomb carries roughly 70 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb, and this single bomber is carrying 4 of them.
So roughly 280 Hiroshimas sitting in the belly of one airplane. And what does 25-year-old Michael Rooney do?
He reaches out and touches them.
He puts a physical hand on each of these apocalyptic, civilization-ending weapons and gives them a good tug just to make sure they are locked in tight on their racks. It's the exact same motion you or I might use to check if a cooler is strapped down on the back of a pickup truck.
That physical interaction tugging on a thermonuclear weapon is the ultimate manifestation of the crisis in perception. The human mind simply cannot hold the reality of 1.45 megatons of destructive power in its active consciousness, while also performing standard mechanical checks.
It would break you.
The brain forces a categorization. It takes the unnameable terror of a hydrogen bomb and reclassifies it as cargo.
So after they verify the cargo is secure, they climb up into the cockpit, they begin their standard systems check, and they find a couple of glitches.
Just normal mechanical stuff.
Yeah, the UHF radio is acting up, and an oil pressure gauge on one of the engines is showing a wonky reading. These are massive, highly complex machines, so minor mechanical issues are completely expected. They call maintenance, get the issues addressed, which puts them about 11 minutes behind schedule.
Which is nothing.
Right. And just after 6 p.m., they rumble down the runway and take off. Once they hit cruising altitude, Wendorf lights up a cigarette and settles into his seat.
So we have to ask structurally, what is this flight actually doing? Why are they in the air?
It was part of a program.
This specific mission is part of an overarching program called Chrome Dome. That was the operational classified name for the Strategic Air Command's airborne alert system. Wendorf and his crew are flying out across the Atlantic Ocean, heading toward the Mediterranean Sea.
But they're not alone.
No, they are not an isolated flight. They are part of a continuous, globally rotating presence. At any given second of the day or night, there are heavily armed American bombers in the sky, flying designated routes that put them within striking distance of the Soviet Union.
It is incredibly jarring to think about the simultaneous realities occurring at this exact moment. Down on the ground, the evening news is broadcasting stories about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs.
Or the escalating ground war in Vietnam.
Right. Secretary of State Dean Rusk is holding press conferences about military measures in Southeast Asia. People are eating dinner, watching television, going to sleep. And meanwhile, 35,000 feet above the Earth, an armada of bombers loaded with hydrogen bombs is constantly circling, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, waiting for a code that will end the world.
The strategic doctrine of 1966 demanded this posture. It's crucial to understand the incentive structure of the Cold War at this specific juncture. Policymakers and military leaders in the United States operated under the belief that the only way to prevent the Soviet Union from launching a surprise nuclear attack was deterrence.
But deterrence only works if it is completely credible.
Credible and visible. The Soviets had to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that even if they destroyed every single American city and missile silo in a first strike, a devastating American counterattack was already airborne, invulnerable, and on its way to Moscow.
So the system required permanence. It required endless repetition. And it required speed. You couldn't wait to fuel up the planes after the sirens went off.
Exactly. The logic of deterrence dictated that the weapons must always be in motion. That is the macro-level incentive structure. But to understand how we arrived at a point where flying millions of tons of explosive power around the clock was considered a logical, everyday administrative procedure, we have to look backward.
We need to trace the architectural origins of the Strategic Air Command.
And that means we have to talk about General Curtis LeMay.
Yes, Curtis LeMay, known to his men, quite affectionately by some and terrifyingly by others, as Iron Ass.
A very fitting nickname.
You really cannot decouple the concept of the Strategic Air Command from the personality and philosophy of Curtis LeMay. To understand how SAC functioned in 1966, we have to go back to World War II, specifically to the Pacific Theater in 1945.
LeMay is the primary architect of this entire machine. His worldview was forged in a very specific crucible. Let's look at the operational reality he faced.
So it's March 9th, 1945. We are on the South Pacific island of Guam. LeMay is 38 years old. He's this tough, notoriously gruff, cigar-chewing general who has just been brought in to take command of the 21st Bomber Command.
And they were tasked with the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands.
But they were, by all military metrics, failing miserably. They simply were not producing the results Washington demanded.
And we have to look at why they were failing. It wasn't necessarily a lack of pilot skill. It was a collision between technology and the environment. The primary weapon they were using was the B-29 Superfortress. It was an advanced aircraft, but the environment over Japan was actively working against it.
To weather, mostly.
First, the weather was terrible. There was almost constant cloud cover over the Japanese home islands, which made the high-altitude, visual precision daytime bombing that the Americans preferred practically impossible.
But the bigger issue was something they didn't fully understand until they got up there, the jet stream.
Yeah, those winds.
At 35,000 feet, these massive bombers were hitting wind currents that were phenomenally strong, and those winds were just devouring their fuel. To put some numbers to it, a B-29 needed roughly 23 tons of aviation fuel just to make the round trip from the Mariana Islands to Tokyo and back.
That's a massive payload just in fuel.
Because they were carrying so much fuel just to fight the wind, they had to drastically reduce their actual bomb payload. They could only carry about 3 tons of bombs.
So from a systems perspective, the process was incredibly inefficient. They were burning vast amounts of energy and resources to fight an atmospheric phenomenon, only to drop a very small payload with very low accuracy due to the cloud cover and then limp home.
Right.
LeMay looked at this and knew that if he didn't drastically alter the equation, he was going to be replaced. He needed a solution that would fundamentally change the mathematics of the bombing campaign.
And the solution he came up with was one of the most massive, consequential gambles in military history. LeMay realized that fighting the jet stream was a losing battle, so he decided to completely change the parameters of the mission. He ordered his crews to strip the B-29s of almost all their defensive machine guns.
To remove the gunners.
And to take out the heavy ammunition. By doing this, he drastically reduced the weight of the aircraft.
Which is a purely pragmatic, almost ruthless calculation.
It gets more ruthless. He then ordered these stripped-down, essentially unarmed bombers to fly in at night and to do it at a radically low altitude under 10,000 feet. By flying that low, they completely bypassed the high-altitude jet stream.
By avoiding the wind and reducing the weight of the defensive armaments, LeMay solved the fuel consumption problem. And how did he utilize that saved weight?
He doubled the bomb payload. He replaced the high-explosive bombs with M69 incendiary clusters, napalm. But he was sending hundreds of heavy bombers, devoid of their usual defenses, flying low and slow right into the teeth of the enemy's home territory. He made a calculated bet that the Japanese night fighter defenses and anti-aircraft guns were weak enough that the bombers could survive.
But even LeMay, with his iron exterior, was agonizing over the risk.
The book notes that an Air Force public relations officer found LeMay sitting alone on a wooden bench at 2 o'clock in the morning while the planes were in the air over Tokyo. LeMay was smoking his cigar in the dark, and he told the officer, "I'm sweating this one out. A lot could go wrong. I can't sleep."
That moment on the bench is critical for understanding his psychology. He understood the immense risk he was taking, but the gamble paid off, resulting in the devastating firebombing of Tokyo.
Which killed upwards of 100,000 people in a single night and leveled huge swaths of the city.
For LeMay, the lesson was permanent. His entire subsequent military philosophy was forged in the fires of that night. He internalized the belief that overwhelming, uncompromising force, extreme operational discipline, and a willingness to accept massive, high-stakes gambles were the only true metrics of military success.
And he brought that exact, uncompromising mindset into the post-war era when he was given command of the newly formed Strategic Air Command.
And SAC desperately needed some kind of structural overhaul when LeMay took over in 1948.
Because immediately following the end of World War II, the United States had rapidly demobilized. The massive military machine had been dismantled, soldiers went home, funding dried up. When LeMay arrived at SAC headquarters, he found an organization that was casually referred to as a cream puff outfit.
The cream puff outfit.
The crews were so inexperienced and poorly trained that they literally lacked basic navigational skills. LeMay ordered a mock bombing run over Dayton, Ohio, just to test their baseline competency. Not a single airplane successfully completed the mission as assigned. Most of them couldn't even find the city.
LeMay was absolutely appalled.
So, what does a commander with LeMay's specific wartime trauma and learned philosophy do when faced with incompetence?
He institutionalizes relentless, punishing readiness. This is the moment the system we're discussing today begins to crystallize. LeMay systematically purged the existing command structure. He fired the officers he deemed soft and replaced them with his battle-hardened loyalists from the World War II bombing campaigns.
He implemented training regimens that bordered on the abusive.
He forced his flight crews to practice navigation, bombing runs, and emergency procedures until they were physically exhausted, and then he forced them to practice some more.
He didn't just rebuild the culture, he built a physical empire. LeMay was a master at navigating the newly forming military-industrial complex. He secured massive congressional funding. He built brand-new, comfortable housing on the bases for the airmen, understanding that if he was going to demand their absolute dedication, he had to provide for their families to keep morale high.
And he also constructed an incredible state-of-the-art communications infrastructure.
Right. He spent $1 million, which was a staggering sum at the time, to build a dedicated telephone and teletype system that linked every single SAC base across the globe directly to his centralized headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska.
He wanted the ability to pick up a red phone and instantly command his forces anywhere on the planet. Through sheer force of will, he turned this ragtag cream puff outfit into the most technologically advanced and lethal military force in human history.
And he motivated this vast apparatus by preaching a very specific, simplified geopolitical gospel. LeMay frequently described global politics in terms of a schoolyard. In his view, the Soviet Union was the aggressive bully testing the boundaries, and the United States, specifically SAC, was the muscle-bound, gentle giant.
The giant didn't inherently want to fight, but it needed the capacity to knock the bully out with one devastating punch if provoked. However, to maintain that posture credibly, SAC could not be a hollow threat. It had to be ready to go to full-scale nuclear war, not next year, not next week, but today, within the hour.
That demand for immediate readiness brings us to a crucial theoretical concept pioneered by the RAND Corporation.
RAND was a highly influential think tank, initially sponsored by the Air Force, tasked with applying complex mathematical and systems analysis to military strategy. They began studying SAC, and they introduced a terrifying metric called alert time.
Alert time. The RAND analysts, applying game theory and systems logic, looked at the massive centralized infrastructure LeMay had built, the gleaming bombers parked in neat rows on massive tarmac runways, and realized it was deeply structurally vulnerable.
They asked a simple question. If the Soviet Union launched a preemptive surprise nuclear attack, how much warning time would SAC actually have to get its bombers off the ground?
Math was incredibly grim. If SAC had 2 hours of advance warning, the analysts calculated that perhaps 35% of the bomber fleet would be destroyed on the ground before they could take off.
But what if it was a total surprise? What if the warning time was measured in minutes? The RAND model suggested that up to 90% of the Strategic Air Command could be wiped out on the tarmac.
Which, from the perspective of deterrence theory, represents a completely unacceptable systemic vulnerability. If the enemy believes they can destroy your retaliatory capability in a first strike, deterrence fails entirely. It actually incentivizes them to attack.
So what is the logical systemic conclusion to this vulnerability? If your bombers are sitting ducks while they are on the ground, the only mathematical way to guarantee a portion of them survives to retaliate is to ensure they are never on the ground in the first place.
You must put a significant percentage of your nuclear arsenal in the sky, permanently.
And thus, the Airborne Alert Program is born. This is the genesis of the Chrome Dome missions we described earlier with Captain Wendorf and his crew.
I want to explicitly connect this back to your everyday experience of the world as a listener. Consider the incentive structure at play here. When deterrence absolutely must be visible to be effective, and when readiness absolutely must be constant to survive the theoretical threat of a surprise attack, the definition of military effectiveness fundamentally changes.
It stops being about winning a specific battlefield engagement. It starts being measured purely by scale, efficiency, and continuous operation. You have a massive bureaucratic demand for absolute centralized control being forced to coexist with a technology, thermonuclear weapons, that is capable of irreversible planetary destruction.
You are demanding that your operators treat world-ending weapons as routine cargo. And when a system operates under those parameters, under that level of intolerable risk, a rupture is not merely possible. It is a predictable mathematical certainty.
If you fly millions of miles with nuclear weapons, eventually gravity and human error will intersect.
Which brings us from the abstract theory of deterrence crashing down into the brutal reality of a specific Monday morning, the predictable rupture. Let's shift our focus to the collision over Palomares.
The physical clash of the system with reality.
I want to set the scene on the ground. It is the morning of Monday, January 17th, 1966. We are leaving the high-tech corridors of SAC headquarters and entering Palomares, Spain.
A totally different world.
This is a small, parched, impoverished farming village located in the Almeria Desert, which is widely considered the most arid region in all of Europe. The physical environment is punishing. There hasn't been a measurable drop of rain in 3 months.
The riverbeds that cut through the landscape are so persistently dry that when water actually does flow through them, the locals have to use a specific term to differentiate it. They call it a rio agua, a water river, because a normal river is just dust and rocks.
It is a community that feels deeply disconnected from the mid-century modernism sweeping through the rest of the West. Historically, Palomares had been a mining town, extracting silver and lead, but those mines had been tapped out and abandoned long ago.
By 1966, the village economy is strictly agrarian. They primarily farm tomatoes in the dry soil or raise flocks of sheep. To truly understand the technological footprint of this village, consider this statistic from the book. In 1966, out of the entire population of Palomares, there are exactly 8 television sets in the town.
8 TVs.
Some of the villagers are still using donkeys for daily transportation.
The contrast is genuinely staggering. High above this village, completely unseen, you have the hyper-advanced, globally lethal technology of the American B-52 bomber and the KC-135 refueling tanker.
These machines represent the absolute pinnacle of human engineering, aerospace dynamics, and destructive capability. They are marvels of the 20th century. And down below, you have a society rooted in ancient agrarian rhythms, worrying about the tomato harvest and the lack of rain.
This juxtaposition is exactly where the abstract, game theory-driven concept of nuclear deterrence physically and violently intrudes into the real world.
Let's talk about what's happening above them.
High above the Mediterranean coast, it is 10:22 a.m. Captain Wendorf's B-52, which we saw take off from North Carolina the previous evening, is now attempting a mid-air refueling procedure with a KC-135 tanker aircraft.
Now remember what Wendorf confidently told his wife Betty. This mission is perfectly routine, and historically he was correct. The military tracked these things meticulously. This exact mid-air refueling procedure under similar conditions had been completed successfully 18,340 times before by other SAC crews.
But on the 18,341st attempt, the razor-thin margin for error collapses.
We need to explain the actual physical mechanics of what mid-air refueling entails. because the word refueling makes it sound like pulling up to a gas station.
Right, it's not a pit stop.
In reality, it is a feat of extreme aerodynamic precision. You have two massive aircraft. The B-52 weighs hundreds of thousands of pounds. The KC-135 tanker is essentially a flying gas tank filled with tens of thousands of gallons of highly combustible aviation fuel.
Both aircraft are traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, miles above the Earth. The bomber has to fly up directly underneath and behind the tanker, while a crew member in the tanker operates a long, rigid metal pipe called a boom, attempting to physically insert it into a small receptacle on the top of the bomber.
They are physically linking these two massive, speeding objects while suspended in the atmosphere.
And on this morning, the approach is slightly off. The B-52 comes in a little too fast, or perhaps a slightly higher angle than normal. The massive aircraft collide. The boom of the tanker strikes the longer on the main structural spine of the B-52, essentially breaking the bomber's back.
The tanker's belly is ripped open, and its massive payload of jet fuel instantly ignites.
The sky is immediately filled with an expanding fireball.
There was another American bomber flying in the same formation, positioned slightly ahead and above them. Their call sign was Troubadour 1-2.
The boom operator in that plane, who sits facing backward to monitor the refueling, sees the entire sky turn orange. He immediately keys his radio to contact the command base in Moran, Spain.
The transcript of this radio transmission is chilling precisely because of its clinical, procedural delivery in the face of disaster. The boom operator reports seeing massive smoke and flames and confirms that they have lost visual and radio contact with the bomber and the tanker.
The controller at the base radio's back, asking for confirmation of the coordinates. And then the controller adds, almost as an administrative afterthought, of course, weapons aboard.
That phrase, weapons aboard, instantly transforms this from a tragic aviation accident involving the loss of crew members into an international, potentially world-altering crisis.
And while the military command structure is processing that reality down on the ground, the village of Palomares is suddenly subjected to a rain of fire and twisted metal. We get a very clear perspective of this from a man named Manolo Gonzalez.
Manolo's father was a prosperous local landowner, affectionately referred to by the villagers as the mayor of Palomares.
Manolo is sitting outside on his motorcycle when he hears an immense roar. He looks up into the clear blue sky and sees a massive explosion, followed by fiery debris hurtling toward the Earth. A huge section of the bomber's landing gear plummets down and violently smashes into the town's electrical transformer, instantly cutting power.
The right wing of the B-52, still loaded with unspent aviation fuel, crashes directly into a tomato field near the edge of town, erupting into a blazing orange inferno.
The village is immediately thrust into complete sensory chaos. They have no context for what is happening. To them, the sky is simply falling.
Manolo, acting on instinct, jumps into a small Citroen car and drives rapidly toward the hills where he saw a large orange and white parachute drifting down.
He navigates the rough dirt roads, reaches the impact site, and finds an ejection seat. Strapped into that seat is Ivans Buchanan, the B-52's radar operator. Buchanan is alive. Because the automatic parachute deployment systems had failed during the violent breakup of the aircraft, Buchanan had managed to manually pull his ripcord while free-falling.
When Manolo and the other villagers reach him, they use pocket knives to cut away the tangled parachute silk. Buchanan is in shock, shivering violently from the extreme cold of the high altitude.
And the only thing he manages to say to the Spanish villagers is, "I'm cold, I'm cold."
It's a starkly human moment amid the mechanical devastation. But while Buchanan is being rescued on land, there's another critical witness out on the water.
Yes, and this individual becomes one of the most structurally important figures in the entire narrative. His name is Francisco Simo Orts. He is 38 years old, and he is a highly successful, driven shrimp fisherman.
The other fishermen in the region actually called him El Catalan because of his intense business hustle, comparing him to the famously industrious merchants of Catalonia.
On this morning, he is out at sea, captaining his boat, the Manuela Orts Simo. Now, to determine his exact location to drop his shrimp nets, Simo doesn't rely on electronic navigation or radar. He uses a deeply ingrained system of visual triangulation.
He looks at the coastline and lines up specific geographical features. He knows that if he visually aligns a specific abandoned smelting chimney on the coast with a particular notch in a distant hill, He knows his precise mathematical location on the water.
He possesses a mastery of local situated knowledge. He understands his environment intimately without the need for abstract technological mediation.
Exactly. Simo is on the deck of his boat. He looks up at the bright sky, and he witnesses the fiery explosion. And then, trailing behind the falling debris, he sees 5 distinct parachutes floating down toward the surface of the Mediterranean.
2 of the parachutes hit the water relatively close to the shore. One parachute gets caught in a thermal updraft and sails high over his head, drifting far out to sea. But 2 of the parachutes splash down very close to his boat.
He is close enough to get a very clear look at them before they hit the water, and he immediately realizes they are carrying something grim.
He describes seeing one parachute carrying what looked like half of a man with internal organs trailing out. The other parachute appeared to be carrying a dead man, hanging completely rigid and still in the harness.
The reality of what he is seeing is horrific, but his interpretation is entirely logical based on his experience. He assumes these are the bodies of the aviators.
Simo, acting as any mariner would, hopes that the dead man is perhaps just unconscious. He immediately throws his engines into full throttle and speeds his boat over to the splashdown site to attempt a rescue.
But the objects are incredibly heavy. By the time he reaches the coordinates, the parachute and its massive cylindrical cargo have already slipped beneath the surface and sunk into the dark waters of the Mediterranean.
Simo, realizing he cannot save them, does what he is trained to do. He glances at the coastline, uses his mental map to triangulate the abandoned chimney in the hill, marks his exact position in his memory, and then speeds back to port to report what he saw to the Guardia Civil.
I want to pause the narrative here for a moment of analysis. The margin for error in mid-air refueling is inherently narrow. It requires extreme precision. But the consequences of failure when you're carrying 4 1.45 megaton hydrogen bombs are almost incomprehensibly enormous.
This collision over Palomares was not simply an individual error by a pilot who flew too fast or a boom operator who misjudged a distance.
It was an event that emerged organically from a macro structure, the Chrome Dome airborne alert system, that affirmatively accepted the repeated handling of nuclear weapons over populated civilian areas as a necessary feature of national security.
When a complex system functions like this, continuously operating under a state of intolerable risk, a catastrophe is not an anomaly. It is a mathematical certainty simply waiting for the timeline to extend long enough.
And when that mathematical certainty finally arrived, it triggered a massive, frantic response. This brings us to the next section of our analysis, the blind Leviathan. Because the military response on the ground reveals the profound limitations of centralized power when faced with localized chaos.
The immediate aftermath is defined by a massive asymmetry of information. You have the local villagers of Palomares who have literally had a flaming strategic bomber fall onto their homes and fields, but who have no idea what the aircraft was carrying.
And on the other side, you have the massive apparatus of the U.S. military, which knows exactly what was on the plane and is now scrambling in absolute panic to figure out where their missing weapons of mass destruction have landed.
The military mobilized incredibly fast. They deploy search teams from the nearby bases in Spain, and within hours, they descend on Palomares. They begin scouring the impact zones, and they quickly locate 3 of the 4 missing hydrogen bombs on land.
Bomb number 1 is found relatively intact. It had embedded itself deeply into the soft dirt of a dry riverbed, which cushioned the impact. But the situation with bombs 2 and 3 is drastically different.
This is where the physical reality of the technology becomes critically important.
Yes, because when bombs 2 and 3 hit the ground, their conventional high explosives actually detonated. And we need to explain this carefully because the first thought anyone has when they hear the explosives in a hydrogen bomb detonated is that the village was vaporized in a nuclear fireball.
But that didn't happen. Why?
It has to do with the incredibly precise physics required to initiate a nuclear yield. A thermonuclear weapon isn't just a barrel of explosive powder that goes off if you hit it hard enough. The core of the weapon, the plutonium or uranium pit, is surrounded by a sphere of conventional high explosives referred to as lenses.
To trigger the nuclear chain reaction, all of those conventional explosive lenses must detonate at the exact same microsecond, creating a perfectly symmetrical, inward-crushing shock wave that compresses the nuclear core to a state of supercriticality.
If the timing is off by even a fraction of a millisecond, or if the explosives detonate asymmetrically, which is exactly what happens when the bomb simply smashes into the ground at high speed, the shock wave is uneven. The conventional explosives will blast the bomb apart, but they will not compress the core perfectly. Therefore, there is no nuclear yield.
Which is a brilliant piece of fail-safe engineering, and it absolutely saved the entire region of southern Spain from being erased from the map. But the detonation of those conventional explosives created a different kind of nightmare.
The explosion blasted the weapon casings apart, and it pulverized the radioactive core materials. It scattered highly radioactive shards of plutonium and uranium, along with a fine, invisible dust of radioactive isotopes across 100 yards in all directions.
So immediately the military is dealing with a severe, localized radiological disaster.
Exactly. You have radioactive plutonium blanketing civilian agricultural land. This isn't an empty desert test site. This is where people live and work. The wind is blowing, the dust is settling on the tomato plants, it's mixing with the dry topsoil.
The military has to secure the area, bring in personnel in full, hot, suffocating radiation suits, and begin the painstaking process of scanning every square inch of Earth with Geiger counters. They eventually have to bulldoze thousands of tons of contaminated Spanish topsoil, pack it into thousands of sealed steel barrels, and ship it off to a nuclear waste facility in South Carolina.
It is a logistical, environmental, and diplomatic nightmare.
But as massive as the cleanup effort is, it is entirely secondary to the primary crisis facing the command structure. They have found 3 bombs. They know the aircraft was carrying 4.
The 4th bomb is missing. And the search for that 4th weapon triggers a massive mobilization. You have top-ranking generals, like General Delmar Wilson, flying in to take command of the operation.
You have low-ranking personnel thrust into impossible situations, like Joe Ramirez, a 29-year-old Air Force lawyer stationed at a base in Madrid. Ramirez is suddenly pulled from his routine legal duties, flown to Palomares, and tasked with walking around the village, handing out pesetas to angry, confused Spanish farmers whose fields have been destroyed or irradiated, trying to manage the local claims and prevent a complete diplomatic breakdown.
The military formally establishes Task Force 65. Within days, thousands of men, a flotilla of Navy ships, and fleets of helicopters are deployed to this remote corner of Spain, all searching for one specific piece of metal.
And the search operation perfectly illustrates the contrast between the localized knowledge we discussed earlier and the rigid methodologies of the military machine. The military, true to its institutional nature, places profound trust in abstract data and technological superiority.
They want mathematical certainty. So the military brings in the absolute brightest analytical minds from Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. These are the premier nuclear weapons scientists and engineers in the country.
And what do these scientists do? They turn to the most advanced computational tool available to them, an IBM 7090 computer mainframe. This is a massive, state-of-the-art machine. They begin feeding it data. They input the estimated altitude of the collision, the airspeed of the bomber, the weight of the bomb, the aerodynamic drag coefficients, the estimated wind speeds at various altitudes.
They run the simulations, and the computer churns out a massive 3-foot-thick stack of paper printouts. And the data is conclusive. The computer models dictate that based on the physics of the crash, the missing bomb must have deployed its parachute and drifted far out into the Mediterranean Sea. The models predict the bomb is actually closer to the coast of Africa than it is to Palomares.
But the computer model, for all its sophistication, suffered from a classic epistemological flaw: garbage in, garbage out. The scientists were feeding the computer abstract data based on standard atmospheric models, but they couldn't account for the chaotic, unpredictable variables of a mid-air collision.
What if the parachute partially deployed? What if the parachute was torn? What if the bomb's trajectory was altered by striking a piece of falling fuselage? The massive centralized system, reliant on data, was effectively blind to the nuances of physical reality.
The desperation among the scientists became palpable as the search dragged on for weeks with no results. It reached a point of near absurdity. One of the highly trained engineers from Sandia National Laboratories actually brought a forked stick with him to Spain.
He was literally using it like a water diviner, walking around the Spanish hillsides, hoping he could magically douse for the missing thermonuclear weapon because their advanced mathematics had failed them.
Which perfectly demonstrates the collapse of technological confidence. When the abstract system fails, the operators regress. This is why Francisco Simo Orts, the fisherman, becomes the pivotal figure in this narrative.
Right. Simo, who quickly becomes known to the frustrated American military as Paco de la Bomba Paco of the bomb. Simo approaches the American naval commanders and tells them repeatedly and emphatically, "Look, I saw it go in the water. I know exactly where it is. I lined it up with the chimney in the hill."
But the initial military reaction is profound hesitation. They have their 3-foot stack of computer printouts. They have their state-of-the-art IBM mainframe. They're a global superpower. How can they rely on the anecdotal memory of a Spanish shrimp fisherman?
It requires a massive institutional swallowing of pride. But eventually, blinded by its own scale and exhausted by failure, the mighty U.S. military apparatus has to admit that its predictive models are useless. The Leviathan has to turn to the local, situated knowledge of a man who navigated by looking at an abandoned chimney.
And when they finally agree to listen to Simo and they focus the search on the specific coordinates he provides, they transition into a new phase of the operation, the deep sea recovery. Because Simo's coordinates point to an area where the water is incredibly deep and the ocean floor is treacherous, the military has to deploy a highly specialized experimental deep ocean submersible called the Alvin.
The deployment of the Alvin is a story of extreme physical risk in its own right.
It is harrowing. The Alvin is tiny. It holds a pilot and an observer in a cramped, freezing titanium sphere. They have to dive 2,500 feet down into the absolute crushing darkness of the Mediterranean. The crew of the Alvin had never undertaken a mission like this. They had no idea what they were getting into.
They are navigating steep, jagged underwater canyons, trying to avoid getting tangled in the old, discarded fishing nets that litter the seafloor, operating with rudimentary sonar and a tiny viewing porthole. They are essentially searching for a gray metal cylinder in a pitch-black, rugged landscape using a flashlight.
They suffered mechanical failures, electrical shorts, and constant fear of implosion. But day after day, week after week, they drop into the abyss. And finally, on March 15th, nearly 2 full months after the initial collision, the crew of the Alvin spots the massive gray shape of the Mark 28 hydrogen bomb resting precariously on a steep underwater slope.
The physical recovery of the bomb is a monumental engineering achievement. But the way the military handles the public narrative of that recovery leads us directly into our final section, spin control and the crisis in perception. Because while the military was desperately searching in the dark, they were also waging a massive battle to control the flow of information on the surface.
The public relations spin surrounding Palomares was an absolute masterclass in deflection and institutional self-preservation. For the first few weeks following the crash, the official line from the U.S. government and the Air Force was a rigid wall of silence or outright denial. They formally refused to confirm that a nuclear weapon was even missing. They used bureaucratic language referring to unarmed classified equipment.
But the visual evidence on the ground made the denials absurd.
Exactly. You have international reporters standing on hillsides in Spain watching hundreds of American servicemen trudging through tomato fields, wearing full-body white anti-radiation suits, carrying clicking Geiger counters and shoveling dirt into lead-lined barrels. It was completely obvious what they were looking for.
The international press began openly mocking the U.S. military's lack of transparency. Political cartoonists had a field day. There were syndicated cartoons showing befuddled, sweating American officers walking up to Spanish peasants holding donkeys and asking, "Pardon me, sir, but have you happened to see a stray H-bomb lying around?"
The military looked incompetent and secretive.
The primary goal of the public relations strategy, once they finally located the bomb, was not to apologize or explain the systemic failures. The goal was to aggressively reestablish the illusion of perfect control.
We see this perfectly orchestrated at the climax of the recovery. On April 7th, after a complex and highly dangerous operation involving underwater cables and a robotic recovery vehicle, they finally haul the missing bomb up from the bottom of the sea onto the deck of the naval rescue ship USS Petrel.
And the military decides to turn this into a spectacle. They hold a massive press conference right there on the fantail of the ship. They fly in Admiral William Guest, the commander of the Naval Task Force, and Andrew Biddleduke, the incredibly polished U.S. ambassador to Spain.
And they proudly display the recovered hydrogen bomb, still dented and covered in sea slime, to the assembled world media. Bernard Kalb, a veteran reporter for CBS News, was there, and he noted the bizarre juxtaposition. He wrote that the bomb looked incredibly innocent lying there under the bright Mediterranean sun, comparing it to a bathing beauty posing for photographers. He described it as an extremely dull-looking multi-megaton monster.
Listen carefully to how the military authorities framed the narrative during that press conference. They completely sidestepped the fact that they accidentally dropped 4 nuclear weapons on the civilian population of a friendly allied nation. Instead, they frame the event as a triumph of American ingenuity and perseverance.
They point out the statistics. They emphasize the 18,340 successful mid-air refuelings that happened perfectly before this single isolated crash.
And remarkably, they use the fact that the conventional explosives detonated on 2 of the bombs without causing a nuclear yield as evidence of their safety. They argue, essentially, look how well our safety mechanisms work. The bombs endured a fiery plane crash and an explosion, and they still didn't cause a nuclear holocaust. This proves the system is safe.
It's an incredible rhetorical pivot. They use the near miss of a catastrophe as proof of their competence.
But despite the aggressive spin control, the deeper structural impact of Palomares could not be contained. The incident fundamentally shifted public consciousness. Palomares shattered the pervasive Cold War illusion of infallibility. It proved, unequivocally and visibly, that the United States military did not possess absolute control over its own apocalyptic arsenal.
Millions of people, not just in Spain but around the world, suddenly realized a chilling truth. They were actively being threatened by their own peacetime security apparatus.
It was a stark realization of the deal with the devil that the public had implicitly signed. Americans and their allies had accepted the existence of a massive, civilization-ending nuclear stockpile because they fundamentally believed the government was competent enough to keep it entirely under control.
Palomares ripped the mask off that facade. It showed that the weapons weren't locked away in some pristine, secure vault. They were being flown over their heads every single day, subject to the mundane realities of metal fatigue, engine failure, and human error. The system was a loaded gun that could misfire at any moment.
And yet, despite this glaring exposure of the systemic risk, the machine persisted. The overarching bipartisan belief in the necessity of deterrence, the absolute conviction that continuous airborne readiness was the only valid strategy to prevent a preemptive Soviet strike, converted this permanent state of danger into a strategic necessity. The institutional structure of SAC absorbed the catastrophe of Palomares, categorized it as an acceptable, albeit regrettable, cost of doing business, and kept the bombers flying.
At least they kept them flying for a little while longer, because the final breaking point for the Chrome Dome Airborne Alert Program didn't occur over the warm tomato fields of Spain. It happened exactly 2 years later in a drastically different environment.
January 21st, 1968.
Another B-52, fully loaded with 4 hydrogen bombs on a standard airborne alert patrol, is flying 33,000 feet over Thule Air Base in the freezing darkness of Greenland. The co-pilot on this flight feels a little chilly in the cockpit, so he reaches over and cranks the rudimentary cabin heater up to its maximum setting. The cabin gets uncomfortably hot, so he turns it back down.
But the heater malfunctions. Something inside the ductwork ignites. A small fire starts in the lower deck of the cabin. It quickly spreads, filling the enclosed space of the aircraft with thick, choking, toxic smoke.
The crew is blinded and suffocating. They are forced to bail out into the Arctic night, and the massive bomber, entirely unpiloted and loaded with nuclear weapons, plummets from the sky and violently crashes into the sea ice of North Star Bay.
It is the exact same systemic failure, manifesting through a different, utterly mundane trigger. In Spain, it was a slight miscalculation during refueling. In Greenland, it was a malfunctioning cabin heater. The profound complexity of the nuclear mission was undone by the simplest of mechanical failures.
And it was the Thule crash that finally broke the system. Following the second massive contamination event because the conventional explosives detonated again, scattering plutonium across the Arctic ice, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara finally steps in and says, "Enough!"
He officially cancels the Chrome Dome Airborne Alert Program entirely. The system of continuous airborne readiness had simply generated a level of risk that was no longer politically or operationally tolerable. They had pushed LeMay's machine as far as it could possibly go, demanding perfection in an imperfect world until it fundamentally broke. So as we conclude this deep dive, we must return to our central guiding question. What is the crisis in perception here? The true crisis is that complex systems, constructed in the name of safety and security, possess an inherent capacity to obscure the very risks they continually generate. What we misperceive when we look at an event like Palomares is not just the tragedy of a single isolated accident. What we fail to see is the vast intentional structure that made such an accident entirely predictable.
A surface-level interpretation, the kind you might find in a brief historical footnote, treats Palomares merely as an unfortunate Cold War mishap, a bump in the geopolitical road. But a systems-level analysis reveals a much larger, more troubling design. It exposes a doctrine that actively transformed extreme nuclear danger into administrative normality. Seen clearly, the Palomares incident was not merely a Cold War mishap. It was a glimpse into a system that preserved peace by institutionalizing the possibility of disaster.
And this historical autopsy leaves us with a vital, deeply uncomfortable question for our modern context. We look back at the Cold War, we look at Curtis LeMay and S.A., and we marvel at the sheer terrifying hubris of flying live nuclear weapons around the clock. It seems like absolute madness to us from the safety of the present. But we must turn that analytical lens on our world today. What current invisible systems, perhaps the incredibly complex, opaque, high-frequency trading algorithms that run our global financial markets, or the autonomous machine learning code that currently manages our fragile power grids, water treatment facilities, and transportation infrastructure? What systems are currently operating exactly as designed, yet quietly exposing us to intolerable catastrophic risk, simply because we have fully normalized their daily silent function? We might not have B-52s circling overhead anymore, but the unseen leviathans of our own era are humming along all around us, and we accepted them as perfectly unthinkingly routine.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.